The stars burned cold above the dying fleet. Counselor Verath stood on the bridge of the last Velith warship and watched 3,000 years of civilization crumble into dust. Behind him, the holographic display showed red dots spreading like a disease across the map. The Swarm Collective had already consumed 200 Velith worlds. Now they came for the final 12. "How long?" Verath asked. "6 cycles," his commander replied. "Perhaps 7 if we sacrifice the outer colonies." Sacrifice, such a clean word for abandoning millions to be eaten alive. The Velith had ruled this section of the galaxy for 3 millennia. They had built wonders that lesser species could not imagine. They had seeded life on 10,000 barren worlds, hoping that one day those seeds would grow into allies. Now all of it would be swallowed by creatures that felt nothing, wanted nothing except to consume. "There is another option," said a quiet voice. Verath turned. The speaker was old, even by Velith standards. Her name was Serethi, and she kept the ancient records that most Velith considered myths. "Speak," Verath said. "The seeded worlds. Some of them have developed life. Primitive life, yes. Creatures of mud and stone who have not yet learned to reach for the stars, but they are alive, and the swarm does not hunt what it cannot see. You suggest we hide among primitives. I suggest we survive." Serethi activated a small display. It showed a blue and green world circling a yellow star. "This planet is far from swarm territory. Its dominant species has just discovered bronze. They build small villages. They farm. They tell stories around fires. They are simple, but our scans show they are kind to strangers." Verath stared at the image. The planet was beautiful in its simplicity. No orbital stations, no defense grids, no technology at all, just land and water and tiny creatures living tiny lives. "How many could we save?" 3 ships, perhaps 800 of our people. We would need to destroy all advanced technology. Live as they live, eat as they eat, hide until the swarm passes. "And if the swarm finds us?" Serethi was quiet for a long moment. "Then we die among people who still believe in kindness. I can think of worse endings." The vote was held that night. 800 Velith boarded 3 ships stripped of weapons and shields. They brought only seeds, medicine, and the eternal ledger, the sacred book where the Velith recorded all debts owed and all debts paid. Then they fled into the dark between stars while their empire burned behind them. The landing was rough. The 3 ships came down in a fertile valley between 2 rivers. The humans who lived there had never seen anything fall from the sky except rain and birds. When the strange metal objects crashed into their fields, they ran to investigate with spears in their hands and fear in their hearts. What they found confused them. The creatures emerging from the wreckage were tall and thin, with gray skin and 4 arms. They had no hair and their eyes were too large. They moved slowly like they were wounded. Some of them were clearly dying. A young farmer named Kirin was the first to approach. His wife grabbed his arm and begged him to stay back, but Kirin had always been curious. He walked up to one of the strange beings, a female, he thought, though he was not sure, and looked into her enormous dark eyes. The creature tried to speak, but Kirin could not understand her words, so she did something else. She reached into a pouch at her side and pulled out a handful of seeds. She held them out to Kirin like an offering. Kirin understood. Whatever these beings were, they were hungry, they were lost, they needed help. He took the seeds and nodded. Then he turned to his village and called out, "Bring water, bring bread, these strangers need us." The Velith stayed for 3 generations. At first, communication was impossible, but the Velith were patient teachers and humans were eager students. Within a year, they could exchange simple ideas. Within 5 years, some humans had learned to speak the Velith tongue. The Velith shared what knowledge they could without revealing too much. They taught better farming techniques. They showed how to find clean water. They explained which plants healed wounds and which caused sickness. In return, the humans gave them food and shelter and protection. It was the protection that mattered most. Word spread across the land that the village between the rivers harbored strange visitors. Some tribes came out of curiosity, others came out of greed. 3 times, warriors attacked the village seeking to capture the star-touched ones and claim their magic. 3 times the humans fought back. Kirin's grandson, a man named Dareth, died defending the Velith from a raiding party. He was 17 years old. His last words were, "They are our guests. We do not abandon our guests." Counselor Verath, who had grown old in this strange exile, attended Dareth's funeral. He watched the humans bury their dead with songs and tears. He watched Dareth's mother place her son's favorite toy, a carved wooden bird, in his grave. And he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Shame. The Velith had come to this world to hide. They had not asked these people for help. They had not explained the danger. And yet these simple farmers had given everything, including their lives, to protect strangers they did not understand. That night, Verath opened the Eternal Ledger and wrote in careful script. In the year of our exile on the world called Earth by its people, we were given shelter by the human species. They were weak. They were primitive. They had nothing to offer us except kindness. Yet they shared their food when they were hungry. They fought for us when they were afraid. They died for us when they could have lived by simply looking away. This debt we record in the Eternal Ledger. This obligation passes to all our descendants unto eternity. Should humanity ever need us, we must answer. We must give as they gave. We must sacrifice as they sacrificed. This is the law of the Velith. This is the price of honor. He signed his name and sealed the entry with his blood. 12 years after the landing, Velith scouts confirmed that the swarm had moved on. The danger had passed. The survivors could finally leave. They left at night while the humans slept. They could not explain where they were going or why. They could not say goodbye without revealing truths that would confuse or frighten their hosts. So they simply vanished, leaving behind only a single crystalline marker buried deep in the earth. The marker carried a message in Velith script. They gave us shelter. They asked for nothing. Within a generation, the humans had forgotten the details. The stories of star-touched ones became legends, then myths, then fairy tales told to children who did not believe them. The Velith themselves spread across the galaxy, rebuilt a fraction of their former glory, and eventually forgot as well. The Eternal Ledger gathered dust in a museum on Velith Prime. Scholars sometimes studied it, but the entry about Earth was considered a curiosity, an interesting footnote from a desperate time. 3,000 years passed. And then, on a quiet afternoon in the archives, a historian named Orenthas found something that changed everything. Ambassador Elena Vasquez had practiced her speech 100 times. She had memorized every word, every pause, every gesture. She had studied the customs of 40 different species so she would not accidentally offend anyone. She had worn her finest uniform, pressed and polished until it gleamed. None of it mattered. The Conquered Assembly was the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. 400 species sent representatives to this enormous chamber, where decisions affecting trillions of lives were made every day. Elena stood at the central podium, a tiny human woman surrounded by beings of every shape and size, and tried to make them care about her dying people. The Keithrani Syndicate has attacked 12 human colonies in the past year, she said, keeping her voice steady despite her fear. They have killed over 2 million of our citizens. They have taken another 500,000 as prisoners. We have evidence that these prisoners are being harvested for biological resources, their organs sold, their genetic material extracted, their bodies used as raw material for Keithrani technology. She paused. The chamber was silent, but it was not the silence of shock or sympathy. It was the silence of boredom. We ask the conquered to intervene. We ask for protection under the Charter of Sentient Rights. We ask you to recognize that what the Keithrani are doing is not trade or conquest, it is genocide. The response came from a Keithrani representative, a tall being with scales like polished metal and eyes that held no warmth. The human ambassador exaggerates. It said smoothly, "The Keithrani Syndicate has legitimate resource agreements with several human colonial administrations. If some humans have suffered, it is because their own leaders failed to maintain order. This is an internal matter. The conquered has no jurisdiction." Alina wanted to scream. The agreements the Keithrani mentioned had been signed at gunpoint. The colonial leaders who failed to maintain order had been murdered when they tried to resist. But screaming would not help, so she turned to the assembly and made one final plea. Humanity is new to the galaxy. We know this. We are weak and our technology is primitive compared to yours. We have made mistakes. We have been aggressive in our expansion because we did not understand the rules. But we are trying to learn. We are trying to be good neighbors. Please, do not let the Keithrani exterminate us while we learn. The vote was held immediately. 312 species voted against intervention. 74 abstained. 14 voted in favor, mostly other young species who feared they might be next. The Speaker of the Assembly, an ancient being whose species had been traveling the stars for 50,000 years, delivered the verdict with something that might have been regret. The conquered cannot interfere in regional disputes. Perhaps in a few centuries, when your species has demonstrated stability, we can revisit this matter. Until then, we wish humanity well. Alina left the chamber with her head held high. She did not cry until she reached her ship. Orenthas had been a historian for 400 years. He had studied the rise and fall of empires. He had documented wars that lasted millennia and peace treaties that shaped entire galactic sectors. He had thought nothing could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. It started as a routine project. The Velith Cultural Ministry wanted to create an exhibit about the Swarm War, that terrible time when the Velith had nearly been destroyed. Orenthas was assigned to research the survivors, the few hundred Velith who had escaped the genocide and eventually rebuilt their civilization. He found the Eternal Ledger in a storage vault that had not been opened in centuries. The book was heavy, bound in preserved skin from some creature that no longer existed. Its pages were filled with records of debts, favors owed, favors repaid, obligations that stretched across generations. Most entries were routine. One noble family had saved another during a plague. A merchant house had extended credit during a famine. The usual commerce of honor that kept civilized society functioning. Then Orenthas reached the entry from the Swarm War. He read it 3 times, certain he was misunderstanding. Then he cross-referenced it with historical records, genetic databases, and astronomical surveys. When he finished, his 4 hearts were beating so fast he thought he might collapse. The entry was real, the debt was real, and the species that had sheltered the Velith survivors, the primitive farmers who had died protecting strangers from the stars, were the same species he had just watched pleading for help before the conquered assembly. Humanity. Orenthas pulled up the recording of Alina Vasquez's speech. He studied her uniform, looking for any connection to the ancient past. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed the symbol on her shoulder, an eagle clutching arrows. He compared it to images from the Velith archives. The resemblance was not exact, but it was close enough to make him shiver. 3,000 years ago, the humans who had protected the Velith had carved similar symbols on their shields. Birds of prey, holding weapons, watching over their nests. It could not be coincidence. Orenthas sent a message to the Velith Council requesting an emergency meeting. Then he sat in his study and stared at the Eternal Ledger, wondering how the galaxy would change when the truth came out. Alina was preparing to leave the conquered station when her communication device buzzed with an incoming message. The sender was listed as Velith Historical Archive, Priority Communication. She almost deleted it. She was tired, heartbroken, and in no mood to deal with academics, but something made her open it anyway. The message was short. Ambassador Vasquez *. My name is Orenthas. I am a historian of the Velith Imperium. I have recently discovered information that suggests our two species share a connection far older than either of us realized. I believe the Velith owe humanity a debt recorded in our most sacred ledger, a debt that has waited 3,000 years to be repaid. If you are willing, I would like to meet with you to discuss this matter. What I have found could change everything. Please respond at your earliest convenience. Alina read the message again, then she read it a third time. She did not know what to think. The Velith were an old species, respected but not powerful. They kept to themselves and rarely involved themselves in galactic politics. What could they possibly owe humanity? But she was desperate. Her people were dying. If there was even a small chance that this historian had found something useful, she had to take it. She sent a reply, I will meet with you. Name the time and place. The response came within minutes. Velith Prime, tomorrow. Come alone and bring hope, Ambassador. Your species may need it. Alina stared at those words for a long time. Then she began to plot a course for Velith Prime. She did not know it yet, but she was about to discover that the kindness of long-dead farmers could echo across millennia, and that the universe sometimes remembered what everyone else forgot. The Velith Council Chamber was older than human civilization. Its walls were carved from stone that had been quarried before humans learned to write. Its ceiling was painted with scenes from wars that had ended before humans learned to farm. Everything about it whispered of age and power, and the slow patience of a species that measured time in millennia. Alina felt very small standing there. Orenthas had met her at the spaceport and guided her through the ancient city to this sacred place. Along the way, he had explained what he had discovered, the eternal ledger, the entry about Earth, the debt recorded in blood and honor 3,000 years ago. She had listened without speaking. Part of her wanted to believe it was true, part of her was afraid to hope. Now she stood before the council, 12 Velith elders who would decide whether an ancient promise still had meaning. The eternal ledger sat on a pedestal between them, open to the page that Orenthas had found. We have verified the historian's findings, said the eldest counselor, a female named Sarethi who carried the same name as the one who had first suggested fleeing to Earth. The debt is real. The genetic markers match. The humans of today are descended from the humans who sheltered our ancestors. Another counselor spoke, his voice heavy with doubt. That was 3,000 years ago. The humans who helped us are long dead. Their descendants know nothing of the debt. Can we truly be held responsible for the promises of ancestors we never knew? The eternal ledger does not expire, Sarethi replied. We wrote that the obligation would pass to all descendants, unto eternity. We cannot change those words simply because they have become inconvenient. Inconvenient? A third counselor rose, his gray skin flushed with emotion. You ask us to challenge the Keithrani Syndicate. They have 1,000 warships. We have 40. You ask us to spend the last of our influence defending a species that most of the galaxy considers worthless. This is not inconvenience, this is suicide. Alina wanted to speak, but Orenthas had warned her to stay silent. This was a Velith matter. She was only here as a witness. The debate continued for hours. Some counselors argued that the debt could be paid in smaller ways, a donation to human refugees, a formal statement of sympathy. Others insisted that the words in the ledger demanded more. A few suggested that the debt had already been paid through the Velith's ancient gift of genetic modifications, which had made humanity more resilient and adaptable than they would have been otherwise. Finally, Sarethi raised her hand for silence. "I have listened to all arguments," she said. "Now I will tell you what I believe." She stood, and despite her age, her voice was strong. 3,000 years ago, we came to Earth as beggars. We had nothing to offer except seeds and stories. We could not even explain why we needed help. And yet those humans, those simple farmers who had never seen the stars, took us in. They shared their food when they had barely enough for themselves. They fought for us when they had no reason to fight. They died for us when they could have lived by simply walking away. She paused, looking at each counselor in turn. One of them, a young man named Dareth, gave his life to protect our ancestors from raiders. He was 17 years old. His last words were, "They are our guests. We do not abandon our guests." Sarethi's voice hardened. "Are we less honorable than a 17-year-old farmer who had never seen a starship? Are we so diminished that we cannot match the courage of people who did not even understand what they were protecting? If so, then let the Velith die. Let our name be forgotten. We do not deserve to survive if this is what we have become." The chamber was silent. Then the eldest counselor, a being who had lived for 800 years and remembered the tales of the swarm war from his own grandmother, spoke. "I remember the stories," he said quietly. "My grandmother told me about Earth. She told me about the humans who fed us when we were starving, who fought for us when we were weak. She told me that one day, if humanity ever needed us, we would have to answer. She made me promise." He looked at Alina, and she saw something in his ancient eyes that might have been tears. "I have waited my whole life to keep that promise. I will not die having broken it." The vote was called. It was narrow, 7 in favor, 5 opposed, but it was enough. The Velith would honor their debt. The right of ancient obligation had not been invoked in 6,000 years. Most species had forgotten it existed, but it was still written into the founding documents of the conquered, placed there by the Velith themselves when they helped create the galactic government. The right allowed any species to claim protection for another based on a debt of honor recorded before the conquered's formation. It could not be vetoed. It could not be ignored. It was older than the conquered itself, and even the most powerful species were bound by it. When the Velith filed their claim, the galaxy took notice. The Keithrani protested, of course. They called it a trick, a manipulation, a desperate attempt by dying empires to stay relevant. They pointed out that the Velith had only 12 worlds and could not possibly enforce their protection. The Velith response was simple. They did not need to enforce it alone. Messages went out across the galaxy to every species the Velith had helped over their long history. They asked for nothing except witnesses. "Come to human space," they said. "Watch what happens. Remember what you see." 47 species responded. Some sent single ships, others sent entire fleets. They came not as warriors but as observers, their presence a silent statement that the galaxy was watching. The Keithrani commander stared at the sensor readings and felt the first stirring of doubt. His fleet still outnumbered the humans 50 to 1, but now there were Velith ships alongside the human defenders, and behind them, spread across the system like a vast audience, were representatives of nearly 50 civilizations. Whatever happened next would be witnessed. Whatever crimes the Keithrani committed would be recorded. Whatever atrocities they performed would follow them forever. For the first time in his career, the commander hesitated. But the Keithrani syndicate had not become powerful by backing down from challenges. They had built their empire on fear and cruelty, and the certain knowledge that the galaxy would always look away from the suffering of the weak. The commander gave the order to attack. He was about to learn that humans did not suffer quietly, and he was about to discover that some lessons once taught could never be unlearned. New Carthage was not a large colony. It had 3 million people, a handful of orbital stations, and a defense fleet of exactly 12 ships. Against the Keithrani armada of 600 warships, it should have fallen in hours. It held for 18 days. Governor Marcus Chen knew they could not win. The math was simple and brutal. Even with the Velith reinforcements, a mere 8 ships, all the ancient empire could spare, they were hopelessly outmatched. The observer fleets would not intervene. They had come only to watch. Help from Earth was weeks away. But Marcus had studied human history. He knew that sometimes the point of a battle was not to win. Sometimes the point was to make the enemy pay such a terrible price that victory became worthless. He gathered his commanders and spoke plainly. We cannot save this colony, but we can make the Keithrani remember us. We can make them bleed so badly that they think twice before attacking another human world. We can show the galaxy that humans do not break. His officers nodded grimly. They understood. They had families on New Carthage, children, parents, spouses. They would fight to protect them, knowing that protection was impossible. They would fight because surrender meant a worse fate than death. The Keithrani demanded unconditional surrender. Marcus broadcast his response across every frequency, knowing the observer fleets would record it. You want our surrender? Come and take it. The battle began at dawn, local time. The Keithrani commander expected a quick victory. Human ships were primitive, their weapons weak, their shields thin. He ordered a standard assault formation, confident that his fleet would sweep aside the defenders in a matter of hours. He was wrong. The human ships did not fight like any enemy he had faced before. They did not retreat when damaged. They did not surrender when surrounded. Instead, they threw themselves at his fleet with a fury that bordered on madness. A human destroyer, its engines crippled and its weapons offline, rammed directly into a Keithrani cruiser. Both ships exploded in a ball of fire that took 3 other Keithrani vessels with them. A squadron of mining ships, armed with nothing but drilling lasers and determination, attacked a Keithrani carrier. They burrowed into its hull like insects, their crews knowing they would never escape, their only goal to cause as much damage as possible before they died. A transport full of refugees, ordered to flee the system, turned around and flew directly into the path of incoming missiles meant for the Colonial Defense Station. 600 civilians died to save 30,000. The Keithrani commander watched his fleet take losses it had never experienced before. For every human ship destroyed, 2 of his own were damaged or disabled. His crews reported something they had never encountered: fear. What is wrong with these creatures? He demanded. Why do they not surrender? Why do they not flee? His tactical officer had no answer. In his experience, primitive species always broke when faced with overwhelming force. They begged for mercy. They offered tribute. They did whatever was necessary to survive. Humans did not behave that way. They fought like cornered animals, except animals eventually gave up. Humans seemed incapable of giving up. The ground invasion began on day 7. Keithrani soldiers landed in the capital city, expecting to round up terrified civilians and begin the harvesting process. Instead, they found a city that had transformed into a fortress. Every building was a defensive position. Every street was a kill zone. Old men and women who had never held weapons stood alongside trained soldiers, fighting with kitchen knives and improvised explosives when their guns ran empty. Children ran messages between resistance cells. Doctors treated wounded fighters and then picked up rifles themselves. A 90-year-old grandmother lured a Keithrani patrol into a building she had rigged with fuel tanks, detonating them when the soldiers were inside. The Keithrani advanced block by block, paying for every meter in blood. On day 15, they reached the governor's residence. Marcus Chen was dead, killed 3 days earlier leading a counterattack, but his daughter Sarah had taken command. She was 14 years old. She had been broadcasting defiance on every channel for days, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. My name is Sarah Chen. My father died fighting for this world. My mother died in the first bombardment. I am the last of my family, and I am still here. I will always be here. You can kill me, but you cannot make me afraid. You cannot make me surrender. You cannot make me stop." The observer fleets recorded every word. Across the galaxy, billions of beings watched a child stand against an empire. On day 18, Keithrani soldiers breached the final defensive perimeter. Sarah was alone in the basement of the governor's residence, surrounded by the wounded and dying. She had one weapon left, the residence's emergency fusion reactor, which she had rigged to overload. She broadcast one final message: "For New Carthage, for humanity, remember us." Then she pressed the button. The explosion vaporized 6 city blocks and killed over 300 Keithrani soldiers, including their ground commander. New Carthage fell. The Keithrani claimed victory. But it was a hollow victory. The Keithrani had expected to capture 3 million humans for harvesting. Instead, they found a ruined world. Most of the population had died fighting or had destroyed themselves rather than be taken alive. The resources they extracted barely covered the cost of the campaign. And the cost was staggering. 112 Keithrani ships destroyed, 40,000 soldiers dead. An entire invasion force bled white by a colony that should have surrendered in the first hour. The observer fleets transmitted everything: the images of human ships ramming enemy vessels, the recordings of civilians fighting to the last breath, Sarah Chen's final broadcast. Across the galaxy, species that had dismissed humanity as irrelevant began to reconsider. The Torvani hegemony, a military power that respected courage above all else, sent a message to Ambassador Vasquez: "We wish to discuss mutual defense arrangements." The crystalline minds of Urath, who had not communicated with organic life in 10,000 years, emerged from their silence. "These humans interest us. We would learn more." The Merchant Confederation of the Outer Rim, always practical, revised their risk assessments. Trading with humans is profitable. Attacking them is not. Elena Vasquez, watching from her refugee carrier, wept for New Carthage. 3 million dead, a world destroyed. Her heart broke for every one of them. But through her tears, she saw something else. She saw the galaxy changing. She saw fear becoming respect. She saw dismissal becoming curiosity. The Velith had made humanity visible. The people of New Carthage had made humanity unforgettable. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, Sarah Chen's last words echoed like a promise: "Remember us, remember us, remember us." The galaxy would remember. It would never forget. 50 years had changed the galaxy in ways that no one had predicted. Elena Vasquez stood at the window of her office on Velith Prime and watched ships from 100 different species move through the orbital traffic lanes. She was no longer Ambassador Vasquez. She was Secretary General Vasquez now, leader of the Human Confederacy, representative of 40 colony worlds and 12 billion people. Her hair had turned gray. Her face carried the lines of decades spent in negotiation rooms and council chambers. But her eyes still held the same fire that had burned when she pleaded for humanity's survival before the Conquered Assembly so many years ago. Tomorrow was the anniversary. 50 years since the Velith had invoked the right of ancient obligation. 50 years since New Carthage. 50 years since a 14-year-old girl had shown the galaxy what humans were made of. Elena thought about Sarah Chen often. She had never met the girl, but she carried her memory like a weight in her chest. Every human did. New Carthage Day was the most sacred holiday in the Confederacy, a day of mourning and remembrance and fierce, defiant pride. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. Secretary General, Historian Orenthes has arrived. Elena smiled. "Send him in." The door opened, and Orenthes entered. He moved slowly now, 450 years old, ancient even by Velith standards, but his mind was still sharp. He had spent the past 5 decades documenting the relationship between humans and Velith, writing histories that would be studied for millennia. "Old friend," Alina said, embracing him carefully. "Old friend," he replied, his 4 arms wrapped around her gently. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" "I have been ready for 50 years. The Keithrani Syndicate no longer existed. It had not been destroyed by humanity, not directly, but the images from New Carthage had spread across the galaxy like fire. Species that had tolerated Keithrani predation for centuries suddenly found their courage. Old alliances formed. New coalitions emerged. Within a decade, the Keithrani found themselves surrounded by enemies who no longer feared them. Their empire had collapsed in a war that lasted 12 years. The species they had harvested rose against them. The rivals they had intimidated joined forces, and everywhere the battle cry was the same: "Remember New Carthage." Humanity had fought in that war, of course. Human ships had been in the fleet that finally broke the Keithrani home world's defenses. Human soldiers had walked through the ruins of the harvesting facilities, where millions of sentient beings had been processed like cattle. But the victory was not theirs alone. It belonged to everyone who had watched Sarah Chen's last broadcast and felt something change inside them. It belonged to every species that had decided, finally, that some things were worth fighting for. The galaxy had transformed, and humanity had transformed with it. The ceremony was held in the Grand Assembly Hall on Velith Prime, the same chamber where the Council had voted to honor the ancient debt. But now it was filled with representatives from across the galaxy. Over 200 species had sent delegates. Many of them were young civilizations, species that had achieved spaceflight in the past 50 years. They had come because of what humanity represented. Alina walked to the central podium. Beside her was Orenthes, carrying the Eternal Ledger, the same book where a desperate counselor had recorded humanity's kindness 3,000 years ago. 3 millennia passed, Alina began, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. Your ancestors came to my world broken and afraid. They had lost everything. They had nowhere to go, and my ancestors, simple farmers who had never seen the stars, took them in. She paused, looking out at the assembled delegates. Those farmers did not know they were making history. They did not know they were creating a debt. They did not expect anything in return. They simply saw beings in need and chose to help. That was all. That was everything. Orenthes stepped forward, opening the ledger to the ancient entry. The Velith recorded that debt in their most sacred book, Alina continued. They promised that if humanity ever needed help, they would answer. And when we needed them most, when we were weak and afraid and the galaxy had abandoned us, they kept that promise. Her voice grew stronger. They backed us when it cost them. They stood beside us when it was dangerous. They called in favors they had spent millennia accumulating, all to protect a species that most of the galaxy considered worthless. And because they did, we survived. Because they did, we grew. Because they did, we are here today. She turned to Orenthes. The debt is paid. The ledger is balanced. We have given back 1,000 times what was given to us. By any measure, the obligation is fulfilled. She took the old historian's hand, a human gesture he had learned to accept. But we have learned something in these 50 years. Debts of honor do not end when they are paid. They transform. They become something greater than obligation. They become something more precious than duty. She looked out at the assembly, at the hundreds of species watching. They become family. The applause lasted for several minutes, but Orenthes was not watching the delegates from the great powers. He was watching the back of the hall, where the representatives of the youngest species sat. There were dozens of them, civilizations that had achieved spaceflight in the past few decades, species still learning the rules of a complex and often cruel galaxy. They watched Alina with expressions that Orenthes had learned to read over his long career. It was not fear, it was not envy, it was not suspicion. It was hope. They had heard the story of New Carthage. They knew how humanity had been weak once, dismissed and ignored and preyed upon. They knew how the Velith had honored an ancient promise, how the galaxy had watched, how everything had changed. And they wondered if someone might do the same for them. That was humanity's true legacy, Orenthas realized. Not their military strength, though they were strong now. Not their economic power, though they were wealthy. Not even their stubborn courage, though that courage had become legend. Their legacy was the idea they represented, the belief that kindness mattered, the faith that debts of honor were worth keeping, the proof that a single act of generosity, given freely in the darkness, could echo across 3,000 years and change the fate of civilizations. After the ceremony, Alina found Orenthas standing alone on a balcony overlooking the ancient city. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I am thinking about a young farmer named Kirin," Orenthas said. 3,000 years ago, he saw strange beings emerge from a crashed ship. He had every reason to fear them. Instead, he called for water and bread. He chose kindness. He turned to look at Alina, and his ancient eyes held something that might have been wonder. One small choice, one moment of compassion, and here we stand, 3 millennia later, in a galaxy transformed by that choice. Do you think Kirin could have imagined this? Alina smiled. "No, I think he just saw people who needed help and decided to help them. That is what humans do." "That is what the best beings do," Orenthas corrected gently, "of any species." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the ships move across the sky. Tomorrow there would be new crises to manage, new conflicts to resolve, new challenges to face. The galaxy was still vast and complicated and often cruel, but it was also changing. Slowly, painfully, but truly changing. And it had all started with a handful of seeds, offered in friendship by strangers from the stars, accepted in kindness by farmers who had nothing but their humanity. Some debts could never truly be repaid, but they could be transformed. They could grow into something greater than anyone imagined. They could become destiny.